Hey friends, if you're responsible for production APIs, you know that you want to be the first one to know when there are issues. And this is where synthetic monitoring shines. In this video, I will show you how you can set up checklist API checks in just a few minutes for your API monitoring. Sounds good? Let's go. If your current monitoring solution relies on your users to trigger exceptions, you are not the first one to notice that something is off. If you add synthetic monitoring to the mix, you can check your APIs and even websites with headless Chrome on a schedule from around the globe to really be certain that everything is working properly. So if, for example, your core business relies on a few API endpoints and they have to be up at all times, should you check them once a minute? I would say so. And this is what we're going to do in this video. Here at Checkly, for example, we rely on our own API endpoints to show this dashboard. And when we go to our API docs, we have here this list all checks API endpoint that we will find under v1/checks. And if this one would be down, this whole dashboard wouldn't be working properly. So let's set up an API check for it. When we press the blue plus button here, we can choose between browser checks. Remember, headless Chrome is also possible. API checks, we will do that in a minute. Multi-step checks for chained API calls, and cron or heartbeat monitoring if you want to monitor your serverless cron jobs. But let's create a new API check. To create a new API check, you have to give it a name. So let's call this list checks API. We have to give it a tag. So let's call this critical. And now we can configure all our API request details. In our case, we want to make a get HTTP call. And here we have the API endpoint URL, which I will paste in. So it's api.checklihq.com/v1/checks. And now I can already run this request. So let's do that. Checkly now makes this request and the API is responding with unauthorized 4.1. We are missing some headers. So let's add these. Depending on what you want to monitor, you can define your request body. So we have here no body, JSON, GraphQL, good old form parameters or raw data. In our case, we want to make a normal GET request, and this one doesn't require to define a request body. But what we want to do is we want to define some essential headers. To communicate with the Checkly API, we have to define an authorization header, and also we have to specify the account that we want to use. And with that, we are ready to try our future API monitoring yet again. And here we get some data, and this is pretty much the data that we've just seen in the Checkly dashboard. These are all my synthetic monitors. But this API check isn't monitoring anything yet. So let's see what else we can configure. If you want to set up your HTTP request or do anything with the response after the HTTP call was made, you can use setup and teardown scripts, but I won't go into much detail here. If you want to learn more about them, check out this video. If you value performance, you can also define response time limits. So Checkly can let you know when your API endpoint degraded in performance after a certain threshold, so let's say after 2 seconds, and you can consider it as failed when the API response took longer than, let's say, 5 seconds. And here we come to the important part. We can add assertions. So first of all, I expect that the API response has the status code of a proper 200, but I also want to check the response body. So for this, I can choose JSON body here, and I can say $, which represents the current response. And I know that it is an array, and I want to pick the first entry of the array. And then I want to take the ID property. And for that, I want it to be not null. This is only a simple check, but for me right now is good enough to know that this API endpoint returns some data with a proper status code. What else do we get? Here we have the scheduling strategy that comes in play when we run from multiple locations. So parallel runs always runs all locations in your defined frequency. So if you want to monitor your endpoint every 5 minutes, all defined locations will run at once. If you decide to go round robin, all your locations will rotate, and with every one, another location will be chosen. I think I want to go with parallel runs, and I want to decide to run my API checks from North California, Frankfurt, Stockholm, Hong Kong, and let's take Mumbai. And with that, we're almost through. We have here the most important thing. How often do we want to check our API endpoint? I want to go with once a minute. And then we have to finally define retries and the alert settings. When an API check failed, you can use retries to define when Checkly should try again, because maybe your API recovered And the alert settings allow you to specify if you want to receive an email, PagerDuty alert. All these alert channels can be defined via alert settings. And with that, let's hit run and save to create our API check. Here we go. Here we have the final data. All our assertions are green. Let's save and create the check. And here we go. We just created our new API check. When we now scroll down, here we have it, list checks API. And there's not so much data yet, but here we already have a few results. Here we have all our locations. And to show you what you can access here in the check details, let's head back to the dashboard and check another API check. When we look into this Checkly runtime API check, this is running for quite a while. And you see that you have access to all the results, but we also aggregate performance statistics and also check what the response times are from different locations. So if you value data about your API endpoint, it's always good to drill down into the API monitoring results. So with this, we now started monitoring one of our own API endpoints in roughly 5 minutes. And I think this is a pretty good deal. There's only one thing that I want to mention still. We now created this API check from within the Checkly UI. And this is great to get started. But if you get more advanced, you usually want to put your monitoring configuration in code. And this is also possible with Checkly thanks to monitoring as code. So when I now head over to my editor, here we have a monitoring as code definition using the Checkly CLI. And everything you define in the UI, you can also put in code. As you see here, I define the same API check in code. And I now can go to my terminal and I can test it locally or in CI/CD, and then I can update my monitoring resources automatically. I won't cover monitoring as code here right now, but of course we have another video on that here on the channel. And that's all I have for you today. We started API monitoring for one of our very own API endpoints in roughly 5 minutes, and I now get juicy alerts when something is off with the Checkly API. If you have any questions or comments, drop them below. I will also link some resources in the description. And with that, I will talk to you next week with another tip on synthetic monitoring, Playwright, API monitoring, or generally shipping good stuff for the web. I will see you soon.